Salam, Sanbonani, Mogweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, and welcome to this Sunday's edition of The People's Voice. It's the 14th of June in South Africa. Of course, The People's Voice produced and presented by your host, Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed, for Salam Media, your humanitarian journalism platform and portal. We've got a brilliant show lined up for you today, so I want to be sure that everybody is tuned in so you can comment, ask our guests questions, and share your ideas. Here's how you do it. You can watch the show on the Salam Media Facebook Live. You can listen live via the Salam Media website. You can listen live via the Salam Media app or the TuneIn app, all free to air decoders. And of course, you can join my watch party. So I'm going to start the watch party from the Salam Media page now. And I'll be sharing this to my, it's not giving me a watch party option for some reason. I'm not sure. Share to your story, share to a group, share to a page, more options. I am not sure entirely. But I'm going to share it to my profile anyway, so that people can join the conversation today. Perhaps it's going to take a few seconds to give us the watch party option. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll also share it to my story so that more people know that we have started this show today. And the topic is an important one, hashtag We Can't Breathe, from South Africa to Palestine. Still not getting that watch party option. Maybe Ibrahim or Sadiq can let me know what issue we're facing there. Okay. All right, let's see. We've already got Dr. Raj Gavender saying hello, joining the show today. And of course, we wish him all the very best. I believe he's not very well at the moment. And our thoughts and prayers go out to him. Okay, so today our conversation is about hashtag We Can't Breathe. You would have heard about I Can't Breathe, which is the rallying cry of the Black Lives Matter movement that is strong in the US currently, but is also having a ripple effect in countries around the world. So we're in conversation with two brilliant activists and academics, Songezo Mazizi as well as Iskander Abbasi, to talk about We Can't Breathe from South Africa to Palestine. Let me tell you more about them. So Songezo Mazizi is a Right to Know board member. He's a former student leader, instrumental in organizing students against unjust policies that promote inequality and exclusion at universities in the Western Cape. He's also amongst the leaders of the groundbreaking Fees Must Fall campaign, currently coordinating and representing 143 security workers against their unfair dismissal. Iskander Abbasi is a Palestinian-American scholar and activist, also a PhD candidate at the University of Johannesburg. His work deals with the fields of Islamic liberation, theology, and decolonial studies. He's an activist with Africa for Palestine, A4P, and has been involved in Black-Palestinian solidarity work in the past decade in the USA. And on that note, I want to welcome to camera Songezo Mazizi and Iskander Abbasi.
Dumelang, salam, good evening.
Good evening, salam, sawubona, as I would say from KZN, and welcome to the People's Voice. The gentleman on my right wearing the Palestinian keffiyeh, of course, is Iskander Abbasi. We're just waiting for Songezo to come onto camera as well. I know he's having a network issue, so that could possibly be the reason why. And I'm still not getting the watch party option, and I have no idea why, but let's see. We are getting comments already, like I said, from the Salam Media page from people that are joining the conversation today. And let's start here, Iskander, while we wait for Songezo to join us. In your view, you've obviously been watching the Black Lives Matter movement for a number of years. You've been involved in Palestinian solidarity. You're living in South Africa. You understand the struggles we face here. And of course, struggles are intersectional and interregional. In your view, how is the Black Lives Matter movement relevant to Palestinians? How is it relevant?
Sure, Comrade Shabnam. Firstly, I just want to say thank you. Shukran to Salam Media for inviting. I'm very happy to be here tonight to discuss, to share, to debate. I think for me, I guess I can start in a very personal way, having been born and raised in the belly of the beast, so to speak, in the United States. When Black Lives Matter first exploded onto the scene, I was in my early 20s, and I actually went on a solidarity trip down to the place from which this explosion came from, if I can say that. If people remember, in August of 2014, there was a young African-American brother by the name of Michael Brown, who was, in many ways, as we've been seeing increasingly this past decade, he was murdered by the police for no reason, really. You can talk about, oh, was he stealing something? Oh, was he? But there's absolutely no reason this type of police force should ever be used on anyone. And I took a solidarity trip with a number of fellow activists and interfaith leaders from Boston, where I had been studying at the time. And we trekked. We drove about 20 hours halfway across the United States. Ferguson is in Missouri, which is the state or province that is directly in the middle of the United States. And I remember showing up to lend solidarity, to lend support, to be helpful where we could be, but also just to bear witness and to learn. And what we saw in many ways was very, very similar in terms of the police violence and the militarized way the police were reacting to protesters to what we see in Palestine, right? And I remember being there and finding out that during that very week and the week after, Palestinians were actually communicating with our comrades, the protesters on the ground in Ferguson, sending advice and helping them with this new weapon they were facing, which is tear gas, which Palestinians had been facing for a very long time. And they were sending them instructions on what to do. So for me, this is something that I think is very interconnected in terms of the Palestine question, in terms of the Black question in the United States. And if I can maybe just go macro just for a moment to share with our listeners that this is not just about this moment, but this is centuries long. The system that we're dealing with that's killing Black people, that's killing Palestinians. The first Europeans who attempted to conquer Africa did so in the 1450s. The Portuguese ended up in West Africa, right? And they were the first to actually start to colonize and enslave Black people. What were their reasons? They wanted to recapture the Holy Land, and they wanted to defeat the Islamic empires that were cutting Europe off from expanding, right? So they did the same thing. When Vasco da Gama comes in 1498, as many South Africans know, across Southern Africa, he was looking for the same thing. When Christopher Columbus went in 1492 to the Americas, he was doing the same thing. So this understanding of the Holy Land, of Palestine, of Blackness is very crucial to the way that the powers that be view us.
Very insightful explanation, of course, and a personal one as well, because you've been there on ground zero, one would call it, which was Ferguson, and we have the same issues continuing as if absolutely nothing has changed for the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the solidarity of the Palestinians with our sisters and brothers in America and around the world is certainly a joy to behold, because our struggles have that interconnectedness, and we have much to learn from each other in terms of solidarity. So absolutely brilliant to know what you've shared with us already, Iskander. Sadiq, I hope you can get Songezo back, because we're going to need his input, of course. And there he is. I think he's coming back. And we're going to have both the gentlemen on at the same time with us today. Songezo, you're back. Okay, so I just asked Iskander about how the Black Lives Matter movement is relevant to Palestinians. I'm not sure if you heard his response, but it was certainly very interesting, his personal experience of being in Ferguson, when the Black Lives Matter movement originated, as well as lessons in solidarity that Palestinians and Americans who are struggling for freedom were learning from each other. And of course, relating it back to our own struggles in South Africa in terms of colonialism and capitalism, etc. So here's what I want to ask you, Songezo. How is the Black Lives Matter movement relevant to South Africa?
Well, I could between you and Slender. I was very much interested to hear, but because of the network, I'm having difficulties to hear you. I'm hoping you can hear me. You asked me similarities between our struggles here and a struggle within the world as well. I think we have seen, we must understand that the killing of Black people, in fact, affect us internationally. We must be able to respond in the international world when Black people are being killed on the basis that they are Black. I think we must be able to start there before we can be able to analyze other things. But it is very much important that we should note the killing of women and children by men, because the struggle of women is very much important as well. But we can't stand still when Black people have been killed. Black people have been killed each and every day. There was then a debate around why people are why is this too much hyper when a person in America has been killed. This thing is not new.
Okay.
Firstly, not new. It happened before. If we remember, I still remember when we in 2017 when we marched to the African embassy, in fact, consulate of America, within the same context as well. You know, but that note, I'm trying to say, Guti, this is not new, but it is important that as Black people, we must be able to unite. All these struggles are very important. We must be able to be intertwined. We cannot just sit when Black people in Palestine and in Israel are being oppressed, in Israel as well. Those politics and the country politically is able to wedge support against Palestinian people or being oppressed by within the occupation of Israel in Palestine. There's a line of march, there's a political position regard the support, because what people of Palestine is the what we were facing before 94. I think the position is clear there, and the position is clear within as well a boycott of Israel here in South Africa. So the position is clear. I still remember there's still mass campaigns which are happening across the country regarding the support of Palestine. Remember, actions can't only be on the ground only, but as well in terms of the boycotts, economical boycotts. Those ones, I also know what economically the country has been able to boycott economically the Israel country because of its occupation in Palestine.
Yes. So Songezo, before we move on from there, you're saying that the Black Lives Movement is relevant to South Africa as it is to Palestine, based on the fact that people of color, the non-elite, we struggle against basically the same enemies, and we need to stand in solidarity with each other. Okay, I think Songezo is having a bit of a network issue, which he did tell us about, and we'll start to go to a break in a little while. So I want to move to the next question. Iskander, what activities have been held in Palestine since the murders of Collins Khoza, at least 12 other South Africans, George Floyd, and of course Iyad Halak, who is a young man who had autism, who was murdered. So what sort of activities have been happening in Palestine since these murders have happened?
Comrade Shabnam, I think that there have been several. If I'm not mistaken, there was actually a Black Lives Matter type protest in Israel as soon as the uprisings started in the United States, and they were specifically linked to the plight of Black Israelis, meaning Israelis primarily of Ethiopian descent who are Jewish, who have been engaged, especially in the recent past, in anti-racist struggle. There was a massive rally for them. There was another massive rally directly after that against the recent decision by the right-wing Israeli government to annex the West Bank, the occupied West Bank. And that was also a massive protest, in many ways linked to the uprisings happening in the USA. And lastly, there were protests in relation to Iyad Halaq. Iyad Halaq, as you briefly shared, was a victim of police violence very recently in Jerusalem, in Quds, the capital of Palestine. An Israeli police officer basically thought he was a terrorist with no pretense and shot him. And Iyad happens to be autistic. And someone yelled out to the police that he was, but they nevertheless killed him right there in the street. Cold blood, dead murder. And there were protests in smaller amounts in several places in apartheid Israel, in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and many of their chants and posters echoed the same language of the US protest against police brutality and the killing of George Floyd. In one protest in downtown Jerusalem, demonstrators chanted, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And they carried signs that read Palestinian lives matter and justice for Iyad, justice for George. So it's clear our people are conscientizing and seeing the links.
Absolutely beautiful. I know I've seen some of those videos and photographs, and certainly the resistance interregional, intersectional is what gives us hope to know that as the 99%, we can defeat the evil that sometimes feels like it's consuming our world. So before we move on to a couple of questions about how familiar people are with certain murders over others, we're going to take a quick short break, and when we come back, more analysis and discussion with Iskander Abbasi and hopefully Songezo Mazizi. Stay right there.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda. With over 80 years of experience, IG Hussein and Company are renowned for their quality Islamic wear and goods. IG Hussein and Company stock a variety of Islamic items, musallas, kitabs, Medina dates, perfumes and exclusive gifts. We guarantee you a unique and friendly shopping experience for the entire family. Visit our new branch in Overport at 202 Kenilworth Park, Brickfield Road. Open 7 days a week with ample parking and wheelchair friendly. Like us on Facebook or Instagram at IG Hussein for our latest promotions and updates. IG Hussein and Company, your Islamic lifestyle.
Never before has humanity faced a pandemic like the COVID-19 virus.
The World Health Organization has declared the coronavirus outbreak as a global pandemic.
Penny Appeal believes in prevention being the cure, and we remain firm in standing by our commitment to support and help those in need.
The border is closed, so are very, very affected. So
they are lacking in the supplies.
I hope government can find a solution.
Our response is to provide hardship grants to those experiencing a loss in income in the months to come, and hygiene kits for the vulnerable at home here in South Africa and Syria and Palestine. Show compassion in the midst of crisis. Donate to our coronavirus emergency appeal now. Be proactive. Be aware. Help save a life. Donate today. Call 031 11 00573 or donate via www.pennyappeal.org.za. Penny Appeal. Small change, big difference.
Connect and stay ahead with Salam Media. This is Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
You are tuned into The People's Voice on Salam Media with your host Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed, and I'm in conversation today on the topic hashtag We Can't Breathe, from South Africa to Palestine, with my comrades Iskander Abbasi and Songezo Mazizi. Songezo is having a little bit of connectivity issues, but Iskander is here. Let's bring him back into studio so we can continue this very interesting conversation. Comrade, I want to pick up here, right? Why are people more familiar with the murders of George Floyd than they are of the murders of Collins Khoza and Razan Najjar, who was murdered in Palestine, the Palestinian nurse? And I think it's problematic because, of course, all struggles and all loss of life is important. And the more aware we are of the loss of life, brutal loss of life, the more we can stand in solidarity. But certainly, we have observed, and maybe it's a question of the power of the media, but certainly there's a disparity in terms of the coverage and the awareness. What are your thoughts?
I think, Shabnam, that I would agree with Comrade Songezo about what he said, that a threat to Black life anywhere is a threat to Black life everywhere. I'm with that, definitely. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as many of our revolutionary ancestors and leaders have said. But that being said, and taking very seriously the preciousness of Black life in the United States and in other lives, many people don't know this, but Native Americans in the United States are actually killed at a higher rate and amount than Black people. But they don't have the same visibility, thankfully, or not, as Black people. There are reasons for that, but the main thing that I would like to share is that, unfortunately, and this may ruffle some feathers, the reason why we know the name of George Floyd as opposed to South Africans or Palestinians or Kashmiris or the whole host of other millions of people in the global South who are being killed by the same, if not worse, forms of violence at the same moment as now, is that we're dealing with American cultural imperialism. Frankly, Comrade Shabna, America is the world's qibla. America is the direction that people pray, their attention, their lives. The American empire is the apple of everyone's eye. And unfortunately, that also comes out when we are dealing with the issue of so-called minorities inside the United States, Black people, indigenous people, Muslims, Arabs, other people of color. And if we're being frank, because of this system in the global colonized psyche, the deaths of Black and brown people in the United States get more exposure. And to people, unfortunately, their lives matter more than the Black and brown people from the global South. That's just a hard fact that we have to swallow. And I don't think that this should limit us from demonstrating our solidarity between these struggles, our internationalism, our commitment to fighting injustice everywhere and anywhere, because we're interconnected, and a blow to the belly of the beast, a blow to the empire, also helps us here in South Africa. It helps Palestinians in Palestine. But at the same time, we must question, why is it only when things happen in America that we're moved? Why don't we look at our more local context more seriously? And do we have to take on now the police? I'm just giving an example. In South Africa, the issue of police violence or other issues stemming from violent forms of repression. Why do we have to take that issue on now in South Africa just because of what's happening in the USA? Maybe we should. Maybe we shouldn't. And things happen organically. We can't always control these things, and nothing is perfect, okay? But I think ideally, we should attempt to build our struggles in more local contexts and in more global connections consciously. So if I can just briefly comment on some differences between the American context and the South African context. I mean, anywhere outside of the United States of America, really, there's a different relationship with police. America has a very peculiar police force in terms of its violence that you feel just at a personal level, at a systemic level. And it's clear that the relationship with the police here in South Africa is not necessarily the same. I mean, in my humble opinion, and being here for a number of years and being graciously welcomed by the many communities in South Africa, and from what I've learned from comrades and activists, the main problem with the police in South Africa is corruption. That's not to say there aren't
corrupt institution in the country next to Parliament.
Yes. I mean, I learned quickly when I moved to Johannesburg, where I study, that the tip was, if you're driving or if you ever encounter the police, make sure you have some rands on you, make sure you have some cash, because you can easily just say, hey, let's make a deal, and there goes your ticket. So when it comes to the police, I think that is the predominant problem, actually, right? And this is not to deny or say that there aren't other problems with the police, and especially during the lockdown. I mean, people are confronting this issue of increasing forms of authoritarianism and increasing forms of violence. As you've shared briefly, there have been South Africans who've been killed as a result of interactions with the police and military. So I'm not saying this to discredit the connection. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use other struggles to inspire each other, to reflect on one another. That's very important. But let's do this consciously, because the American approach is not the universal approach, right? And people in various contexts, particularly in the Global South, should, in my humble opinion, take seriously their local context in ways that, different strategies they've been dealing with for decades to confront these issues, just as they're open to things from the outside.
If Songezo is back in studio, I'm going to need for him and Iskander to both be on screen at the same time, because this is the conversation between the three of us. So let's keep him on screen as he connects and disconnects. So I'm going to read a couple of comments that are coming through. Comrade, you need to just unmute your mic. Comrade Songezo, let me read some of the comments that are coming through for us. Shah Mohamed, brilliant topic, very sad though. Why must there be cruelty to human? What give these people to hurt another human being? Mustaq Sheikh says, at what stage do we say enough is enough? Too often we see atrocities perpetrated and perpetuated and directed at groups of people of color by people of the system that perfected oppression. We are reactive to spikes in the oppression people of color face, in my opinion, but we need to press on without end now, or we will forever be passive victims. He continues, and that's the same comment. I think he's just posted that comment again. Bram Hanekom raised two fists for you, Iskander Abbasi, on his comment. And Shah Mohammed, yes, Mushtaq, I asked the same question, when is enough enough? When does injustice end? And she continues to say, Iskander, good to hear your thoughts. Comrade Songezo, can you hear us? I'm hoping he can. Okay, I think we've just lost him again. But to continue from what you were saying just now, Comrade Iskander, what changes do we need to see in policing, military, and private security? I mean, it's abundantly clear that these systems don't exist to protect the people. I mean, this is obvious. It's there to maintain this hegemony over the economy and the resources and the predatory elite status, as the ruling class. But we're seeing a lot of changes happening through the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements around the world, such as defund the police, right? Restructure, move that money in directions it needs to move in terms of social development, etc. But what are your thoughts? What changes do we need to see with policing, military, and private security?
I think that you're right, Shabnam, that it's a very serious issue, and we need to think through ways of getting out of this mess. And if I can just maybe briefly have comment on the USA and by analogy, maybe share some thoughts on South Africa. I think in the United States, it's clear, okay, it's very clear that there needs to be a complete overhaul of the policing system. That can take on different forms. The main calls from the current uprising and movements have been to defund, and or the other big one is abolish the police. But what does that mean? Are we going to live in a world without police? What does defunding, redistributing, what other programs come in place to deal with issues of public safety? Before answering this question, I think it's important to actually just question, what is the police, right? And to know the history of the police, because sometimes people in the world get captured by our times and don't realize that the time we're in now was not always like this. The institutions that exist now weren't always there in the same way, at least. So in terms of the police and modern policing, right? The famous French postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault was one of the most poignant analyzers of how the rise of the police and the modern nation state, right? Post 19th century, post Enlightenment Europe, led to a more centralized and pervasive form of policing that didn't exist prior to that, right? So policing has existed in one way or another to a certain extent, but the form that we're dealing with now is actually very unique. And it has to do with the way in which the modern states that we deal with, the modern South Africa, the modern France, the modern United States of America, the modern Canada, the way that they centralized power and the way that they enforced their sovereignty, right, their control over those whom they govern through the police, went up a notch, right? And in the specific context of the USA, what does that mean, right? So in the 1800s, police were much more informal and localized, right? And people coming from community, police were actually people viewed kind of as drunkards who, you know, these kind of sheriffs in the wild, wild west who got one eye open, one eye closed, they're leaning on their chair, they're kind of watching what's happening, what's not happening. But
Right.
Things started to change, right? So in the south of the United States, the function of people who captured slaves, the slave catchers, and the people who put down slave revolts, once slavery ended, became the police. In the
Correct.
north, the people who became the police were the people who were breaking the strikes by the labor unions, the people who were breaking the protests, and also people who were capturing runaway slaves. So from that moment, police became more institutionalized, more centralized, and started to receive a lot more money and a type of military might that never existed before. So when we talk about re-envisioning police, it may seem crazy to us now, but many people lived in a world where the police were actually abolished. And the current Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the kind of progressive leaders in the United States government, has actually stated recently, look, abolished police systems already exist in America, and they exist in white suburbs, because in white suburbs and upper class areas, people have all types of money to form alternative programs that help with public safety, that keep kids busy, that develop people in positive ways that lead to them having a positive future. And the relationship they have with police also is very different. They view them more as friends. The worst they have to worry about is getting pulled over for a speeding ticket. And even then, you know, hey, buddy, sorry, it's okay. But if you go to the Black and brown poor communities, it's like you're in Gaza sometimes. Immediately,
Sure,
after you see
absolutely.
all these videos shot on command.
It's a fascinating insight that you're giving us, and I see quite a few people watching from the Salam Media page, and I think really enjoying the conversation as well, which is great. Comrade Songezo, can you hear us? I think he's frozen again. Okay. All right. Well, we hope it gets better with Comrade Songezo. It's a very interesting conversation. Of course, having this interlapping, interconnected conversation is really very important because it draws the parallels and the connectivity. Comrade Iskander, let's talk about this. Your thoughts on Americans and South Africans being trained by apartheid Israel. I mean, we've always known this, but recently with what's happened with the murder of George Floyd, and the knee on the neck, and the chokehold, and the use of maximum force where minimum force would achieve exactly the same result. It's shoot now, talk later, right? For you as a Palestinian to know that these police and military, etc., are being trained by apartheid Israel, how does it make you feel? How does it make Palestinians feel?
Comrade Shabnam, I think it's a very important question. And I think that it's important to recognize that this doesn't just start with police trainings, kind of going back and forth between America and Israel, but there's a long history of these colonial powers supporting each other. In South Africa, for example, Israel was providing resources and military support to the apartheid regime for a very long time after it came into existence. So that had local effects here too for a long time. But to more specifically answer your questions, obviously Americans have a lot more of their citizens being trained by apartheid Israel. And to my knowledge, there's two groups that are largely involved in this training. One is Jewish citizens of America who make pilgrimage or they go to Israel to claim their birthright, which is something Palestinians have never been able to do. They can become full-time citizens in Israel, and they join the Israeli Defense Forces. Okay, so this is one way that certain American citizens, primarily Jewish citizens, are able to do that. Now, the one that's actually much more bigger and effective and related to our moment is the training of police departments in Israel or by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. Now, this has been happening, at least to our knowledge, for about the last decade. It became very public. I'm not sure if I'm sure there's always there's collaboration happening, but in the last 10 years, we've really opened our eyes to the ways in which the increased militarization of the US police force is happening in conjunction with their training with the IDF, right? So if you saw that horrible, horrible video of the way that George Floyd was very unfortunately martyred, Allah yarhamuhu, may Allah have mercy on his soul. The exact tactic that racist cracker cop used on George Floyd by putting his knee on his neck is something that Palestinians know very well, very, very well, because the IDF has been doing that for decades, right? The different forms of military garb, the tactics that they use at massive protests now, the weapons, the main difference, I mean, it's becoming less of a difference now, but in Israel, there's not a strong distinction between the police and the military. The police is very militarized, it always has been. If you go to Israel, which unfortunately I've never been able to, I've been denied entry twice to visit my homeland, you see police, you see normal citizens, but the police and military are everywhere with guns. It's a highly militarized society. In the United States, people have for a long time made the distinction between the police and the military. But now I think we're seeing the cross-fertilization of American imperial wars, largely in the Muslim world post 9/11, right? Coming back, so-called chickens coming home to roost.
Sure.
Because the weapons, the technology, the tactics they're using are things that they used on the battlefield. And if I can just share lastly, Comrade Shabnam, I remember that same time that the Ferguson protests were happening, I was watching TV one night while we were in Ferguson, and one of the mainstream channels, CNN, I think, was showing an image from Ferguson. And it was one protester picking up a tear gas canister and throwing it back at the police. And the reporter described the scenario saying, and now we're going to report from the American military in confrontation with Iraqi forces. And for a moment, me and the people I was sitting with, we just said, oh wow, okay, so that's in the Middle East. And then the next one we said, hold on, that's in Ferguson. That's in Ferguson. So this connection is increasingly becoming more evident on the ground in the United States.
And there certainly is evidence that there are South African police and military that also have been in training, if not collaborating with the Israeli apartheid state, as much as we don't want to talk about it. The fact is we send our diamonds to Israel to be polished still, but we talk about BDS and supporting Palestine. So, I mean, we've got to be honest about these issues if we are to overcome them. Comrade Songezo, can you hear us? And he's frozen again. We've got 20 minutes to go in the show. We're going to take a quick ad break. And when we come back, I want to talk about evictions in South Africa, in Palestine, what's behind it, who's behind it, and how do we show solidarity? Stay tuned. We're coming back to the People's Voice in about a minute.
Listen to Salam Media.
COVID-19 has been declared a global pandemic, and South Africa has called a national lockdown to curb its spread. At this difficult time, the Al Imdad Foundation is assisting informal traders who lose their livelihoods, the homeless, the elderly, and those who are most vulnerable in South Africa and internationally. Let's fight this crisis together. Donate online at alimdad.com or call 0861 786 243 for more information.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
And we're back on the People's Voice with Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed, in conversation with Iskander Abbasi and to some extent, Comrade Songezo Mazizi having some internet issues. And we're talking about the hashtag We Can't Breathe from South Africa to Palestine, so that we can bring Iskander back onto camera. And let's talk about evictions. It's a hot topic and it should be. We don't talk about it often enough. The evictions of people from their homes. Now, in South Africa and in Palestine, poor people are evicted from their homes and their land, often violently. Here, some of the mechanisms that are used is the Red Ants, which is like private paramilitary force. Then you get the SAPS or the Metro, who are evicting people from their homes. It doesn't matter the weather. It doesn't matter that there's a pandemic. Nobody cares. All of that is just PR political speak. But it is the same in Palestine. It is the same in Gaza and the West Bank and the whole of Palestine. So Iskander, what is behind these evictions? Why are they happening? And to follow on that question, how do people whose voices are heard? Okay, because we have the privilege of our voices being heard. That's a fact. How do we show solidarity?
I don't think it's an easy question to answer, especially for myself. I hope that we can get Comrade Songezo to come back, or possibly yourself, Comrade Shabnam, to comment on the South African context a bit more. What I do know is that in the Palestinian context, home evictions are very common. And especially in Jerusalem. And the way that it's used by the apartheid state of Israel is to force Palestinians into a state of perpetual homelessness, right? And I think that one difference between the context of apartheid Israel, occupied Palestine, and the context of South Africa is that in Palestine, we are still dealing with kind of the main antagonism, the main contradiction of overt apartheid and an overt colonial state. Palestine has still never really reached its post-colonial, post-apartheid moment. Of course, capitalism is intertwined with these symptoms, but I would argue that in the case of Palestine, it's predetermined, right, by the racist functions of colonial power and apartheid. So I think in South Africa, when we're seeing these incidents of home evictions, especially, I mean, these just absolutely horrible, horrifying evictions that we've been seeing of informal settlements during this COVID-19 crisis, right? I think we can say that it's more so a problem of capitalism doing the work. You don't necessarily have overt juridical apartheid in South Africa, overt colonialism. You can argue that there are more latent or hidden forms of neo-apartheid and neo-colonialism, neo-slavery even, that define home evictions in the South African context. But in the post-94 world, I mean, South Africa has gained some forms of liberties that Palestine hasn't. So Palestine is still in this overt, colonial phase with really no degree of self-determination and national sovereignty. So when they are doing these evictions in Palestine, I would say it's more so because of the apartheid, because of the racist colonialism. And it's affecting Palestinians whether they're rich or poor. My family, for example, comes from Jerusalem, and I've never been able to visit. I've never met them. I don't know them. One day, inshallah, I would love to visit and go knock on some doors and salam, is this Bayt Abbasi? Marhaba, I'm from your tribe.
Inshallah, we pray that happens. And it's a very interesting point that you make about latent and direct apartheid. And it is debatable. And I understand what you're saying. But when we draw back the curtain, for me, it's still apartheid. We still have the largest mountain between the elite and the rest in the world. And it's a point that I keep making. And these evictions are a reflection of that. Perhaps it's not based on race, but the majority of human beings that are evicted, whether it's from shack settlements that shouldn't exist in the first place 26 years post-democracy, or it's poor people living in some council flats, etc., or what's going to happen now after this lockdown, we're facing mass evictions of people who could not afford to pay their rent, right? Because only the rich got richer during this time. Everybody else just suffered and became slaves to the bank. So the capitalists are indeed behind it. And of course, race and nationality seems to be the pretext. But at the end of the day, these people, the homeless people in South Africa and in Palestine, are sitting on some valuable property. Lacey Road, which is a settlement right here in Durban, in Overport, there was a fire there a couple of days ago. People lost everything. And it was communities who were on the ground, like the eThekwini Outreach group and organization that was there to provide the relief, not the government. Civil society is not waiting, they're getting involved. But how do these people feel that this so-called democratic government actually doesn't care? But there certainly are parallels in terms of evictions and a lot of solidarity work that needs to happen. Iskander, I want to talk about statues. I read such a lovely meme earlier on today, and it said, the only people that have a complaint about colonial statues being brought down are racists and pigeons. And I would imagine that's absolutely true, right? So we know what's happening
at least the pigeons would poop
in the
on
US. Hey?
At least the pigeons would poop on them. At least the pigeons would poop on them.
Would poop on them, yes. But what's happening in the US is that these slave-owning, slave-driving statues, these monuments to these horrifically evil people, which was staring human beings in the face as repeated trauma every day. You've got to see this person who committed the most atrocious crimes. They're being brought down. Colston was one. I believe Columbus lost his head. Fantastic. But, I think it's brilliant. In South Africa, we're still looking at these colonial statues. It should be, if you want to preserve history, put them in a museum somewhere, but do not give them the stature of being in the public space. What are your thoughts on these statues? I know you've got something interesting to share with us about Columbus as well.
Oh, no, I think that these statues falling, this is a very important and significant development. Very, very important, and it must continue. At a certain level, we can say it's symbolic, yes, in an immaterial way, But I think that this symbolism is also very closely tied to a materialism, right? To a very material way that people on the streets are smashing and breaking these signs of racism, of colonialism, of slavery, of just horrible forms of constant psychic violence. Because, I mean, these statues, they're not necessarily something that put your hands up, you know? They are things that you see and for more subconsciously, consciously reflect on, to view Cecil Rhodes as God, to view, you know, Christopher Columbus as the Qibla, okay? But I think that, you know, speaking of these statues, it's tied to a moment in recent history in South Africa, I think, that is very important to mention, right? In many ways, the decolonial student movements in South Africa have set the tone and frame for these more recent forms of idol smashing. As many of us know, in 2015, we had Rhodes Must Fall exploding on campuses in Cape Town, specifically UCT. Later in the year, Fees Must Fall. That's actually when I moved to South Africa, and I moved and Fees Must Fall jumped off, and I couldn't even register at my university because
what a time.
I happily couldn't register, you know. But South Africa has really, the student movements here have really inspired the world. And that's where the connection went. It started in the global South in this most recent cycle. And then it went to the US, it went to the UK. And I think it's a very important thing that must continue happening, of course, with more material reforms, whether it's defunding the police and refunding other community initiatives, whether it's the decolonization of education that South African universities have taken on in great ways and problematic ways. I think it's a very important development.
Absolutely agree with you. The textbooks and the education system have got to change. People grew up thinking Columbus was, you know, some sort of a hero. He was not. Ibn Battuta, interestingly, traveled far more than the colonial travelers who were thought to have traveled more than anybody else, turning them into demigods. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes to go and 3 questions, Iskander. Even before COVID-19, in most countries, the gap between the elite and the rest, like we've just said, grows every day. Every year in South Africa, it's the largest in the world, the Gini coefficient. And of course, the lockdown has exacerbated economic apartheid in South Africa, in Palestine, in America, and around the world. So talk to us about socioeconomic freedom. I mean, there's no freedom without socioeconomic freedom. Political is one aspect of it. Often it's designed to just, you know, pull the wool over our eyes. But what's the struggle like for socioeconomic freedom for the poor and the debt slave middle class in Palestine?
I think in the context of Palestine, Comrade Shabnam, we especially, I mean, there's kind of a parallel to South African trajectory in history post 94, when Palestinians, through the Oslo Accords, accepted this mediated development of a Palestinian nation state through the control of the Israeli government and the West. We've really seen in the 2.5 decades since 94, a massive increase in neoliberal capitalism in Palestine, many different forms of communal living that were less based on forms of capitalist transactionalism, commodification of social relations and resources. Many of them have significantly broken down, right? So, I mean, you can go to the West Bank, which it's an occupied territory under full military control of the apartheid Israeli regime, in addition now to an indigenous Palestinian Authority-led police force who engages in many problematic aspects too. You see mansions, right? And what's going on? You see the development of this massive city in the West Bank. I'm forgetting, it's Ruwada. There's a massive kind of neoliberal capitalist city that's been developed in Palestine that is, I mean, it's just a replica of this mall culture, malls that we see all over the world that look the same.
Yeah.
Maybe it's in the form of the beautiful Jerusalem stone that we love to see in Palestine, but underneath that stone is a lot of economic exploitation, right? So it's the same, I think, in Palestine 48, what we call Israel proper. Many Palestinians have been ghettoized through economic, racial capitalist exploitation, and also in Gaza. There are mansions in Gaza. So there are elites. There are a type of internal 1% who are exploiting the people in the name often of liberation. And it's something we have to deal with as well.
And we will, because we're honest about it. And that starts the conversations. I want to move on from there, Comrade, to talk about strategies. So what strategies, now that we understand a lot about the context, as much as we can in a 1-hour conversation, what strategies should be activated to ensure that the 99% are less dependent on this predatory capitalist system, that we're sustainable and that we have a voice? What ideas are coming through from our intersectional solidarity and resistance?
Sure, Comrade Shabnam. I don't know if I always have an answer, and I think I'm okay with not always knowing. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that movements, we need to listen to praxis. Okay, so there's a level of seeing how people who are mobilizing are thinking as they're doing. And we need to hear how they're doing that. We need to hear about what's happening right now in Seattle, the city of Seattle in the Western United States, in the state or province of Washington. And they've created an autonomous zone that is a cop-free zone where they're offering many forms of free social services. So I think we should look to what movements do as they're doing it. That's important. Another aspect of this is a type of a deeper reflection and thinking through a promotion of an ideological struggle. And I think that the ultimate aim to upend, at least in the context of the USA, a system that is so deep and sedimented, you need to have bare minimum, very radical reform. And if it comes to it, revolution, right? And when we say that, okay, we're not gonna sugarcoat that violence is not a part of that. Clearly, there's been a lot of violence in the last few weeks, and clearly they have gained a lot because of it. The destruction of property has shaken a lot of people to their core, to the point that you have corporations. I mean, of course, they're BSing, saying Black Lives Matter, but at the same time, we need to view these ebbs and flows in the long-term revolution from a perspective of multi-tiered struggle, right, and intergenerational struggle. There's two very beautiful, kind of frameworks that I have found helpful in my own journey as an activist. One is I have learned from our indigenous Native American comrades this idea of 7 generations, right? So Native Americans have within their theology, their cosmology, their way of life, this idea that we're connected to each other through 7 generations. So what you're doing now is actually a result of your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. And what you do now is going to affect your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, right? And that's very important to remember, that we're not just living in this moment for this moment. The second, and I don't mean to get religious, but there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which it's reported that he said, "In qamat ala ahdikum al-qiyamah wa fi yadihi fasla fal yaghsirha," which basically means if the hour is near, if Yawm al-Qiyamah, the final reckoning is here, and in your hand is a palm shoot, a seed to plant a tree, you must plant it, right? So no matter what, we must keep struggling. Our times necessitate that we not just focus, now I'm thinking of this hadith, of just the economy or race, but really we're facing ecological genocide. We're facing an ecocide. So I think if we don't incorporate some aspect of the environment, something like an eco-socialism, we won't have a planet to fight for the rights of minorities or the poor.
100%, a powerful point they made by Iskander Abbasi, and we're almost out of time. Iskander, I'm going to steal a minute more just for my last question to say, how can South Africans and Palestinians work together, and what is your message to people of the world who are in solidarity struggling for freedom?
I think that we need to keep the pressure on. When do we not, right? I come from a school of thought, whether it's my interpretation of Islam or my commitment to various social struggles that are seemingly more secular, right? That la lucha continua, okay? The struggle goes on, as many said here in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So when we think about solidarity for the liberation of Palestine, the most effective tool we have as people outside of Palestine is BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against apartheid Israel. Palestinians learned from the South African anti-apartheid struggle that they needed a comprehensive and strong international support system to put the pressure on apartheid Israel to end its system of oppression. And just as millions rallied in cities and countrysides all over the world for decades to support the fall of apartheid in South Africa, that's what's happening right now in relation to Palestine. So I suggest for all of our listeners to find Palestine solidarity organizations that support initiatives of boycotting Israeli products in supermarkets, of diplomatic boycotts through the functions of the states that you live in, of putting sanctions on apartheid Israel to support the internal struggle of Palestine. In the context of South Africa, there are many different organizations that do this. I happen to be an activist with Africa for Palestine. You can find them on social media, Facebook, Twitter. There are many other groups, the Palestine Solidarity Committee. There's a coalition for BDS in South Africa. Find any way you can get involved and plant that seed.
So they depend on us for their economies. Pull out the money, boycott, divest, sanctions for Palestine, for struggles in South Africa. They are already adopting it in America as well, boycott, divest, and sanctions. And it works. On that point, I want to thank my guest, Comrade Iskander Abbasi, for a meaningful and a powerful conversation that we've had today on the topic of we can't breathe from South Africa to Palestine.
Shukran. Thank you very much, Comrade Shabnam. It was a pleasure, and I'm really sorry that we didn't get to hear more from Comrade Songezo.
We'll have to bring him back at that point. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
All right, so Comrade Songezo could not join us, but it's been an interesting conversation with Comrade Iskander Abbasi, and you'll be able to watch that conversation on YouTube after the show. Maybe I'll do a watch party during the week as well, just to round up to say gender-based violence is a pandemic in our country, and we are tired, and we should withdraw our economic resources, and we should boycott elections until this pandemic of gender-based violence is taken as seriously as the COVID-19. And remember to ask yourself every day, what am I doing to make a difference in my country and my world? Thank you to our guests, Iskander Abbasi, Songezo Mazizi, our listeners and viewers, and of course, as always, the brilliant Salam Media team. Revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.